and welcome to our talk series, Aspects of Japanese Studies. I'm Junko Habu, the chair of the Center for Japanese Studies, or CJS, and I'm the host of today's show. Aspects of Japanese Studies is a talk series that showcases the research being conducted by faculty, graduate students, visiting scholars, and alumni of the CJS. Each speaker will present a casual 15-minute talk on his or her ongoing project or key research topics in the field of Japanese studies. You can submit questions at any point during the talk using the Q&A section. Please do not use the chat function. Our speaker today is Professor Mark Blum of the Japanese program of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. He's also professor in Buddhist Studies. Mark is the Shinjo Ito Distinguished Chair in Japanese Studies, and he specializes in Pure Land Buddhism throughout East Asia, with a focus on Japanese medieval period. He also works on Japanese Buddhist responses to modernism, Buddhist conceptions of death in China and Japan, historical consciousness in Buddhist thought, and the impact of the Nirvana Sutra in East Asian Buddhism. I'm also delighted to introduce our moderator today, Marta Sanvido, the CJS Shinjo Ito postdoctoral fellow in Japanese Buddhism. So Mark will give his presentation for the first 15 minutes or so, and his talk is followed by comments from Marta, and then we move on to the Q&A session with the audience. Marta will moderate the discussion. The title of Mark's presentation today is Deconstructing Mahāyāna Buddhism in 18th and 19th century Japan. Please welcome Mark.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to present some of my recent research. I'm going to talk today about a kind of emotional upsurge that happened in the end of the Meiji period, and this is about modernity, how modernity impacts Buddhism in Japan, all forms of Buddhism in Japan, and also about the creation of University of Tokyo, the role the University of Tokyo plays in implementing what we call Buddhist studies, and the way in which this critical scholarship affected, not so much I'm talking about the impact, but how we got to this point of what the issue was about how the Mahayana tradition became questioned and disputed in a way that shocked a great number of people. And I just want to point out that the background to this story is a political situation in which the Meiji government is trying to create a new religion to replace Buddhism, in the struggle that they're having in doing that, and the Buddhist traditions, the Buddhist institutions are sort of on their heels. And this scholarship, new scholarship that questioned the authenticity of their own scriptures, led to a great deal of hand-wringing and even people losing their positions, losing their clerical status, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, what I want to point out today, the main thing I want to point out today is that this had been going on for quite some time. And it's not the product of scholarship at Tokyo Teikoku Daigaku at that time, but in fact, the result of, let's say, 150 years of scholarship happening both in Japan and in the West. So if I can, I will jump to my slideshow and we'll go through this as quickly as possible. Okay, so here we go, I think. Yeah, all right. So it's called the Daijo Hibusetsu. The viewpoint that Mahayana was not taught by the Buddha. And today in Buddhist scholarship, we are very interested in the evolution of the religion in India, as before and after it spread to other countries, particularly to East Asia, if you're thinking about this from the Japanese perspective. But in fact, and in that historical reconstruction, or that's still going on today, of course, the presumption is the Mahāyāna scriptures, the Mahāyāna teachings began at a certain point in time, usually around 1st century before the Common Era. The scriptures start to take shape, at least at that time, even if the ideas may have been a little bit earlier. Today, we just assume that all the doctrines of Buddhism, all the practices and beliefs were an evolving, developing phenomenon. But in fact, in the late 19th century, there was a very strong view, particularly among some people who had a particular, shall we say, rigid perspective, that there's an early Buddhism and there's a late Buddhism, and the early Buddhism is the Buddhism that is preserved in the Theravada school of Southeast Asia, because it is not specifically non-Mahayana. In any case, so the impact of modernity really is about how questions come to be asked that had not really been asked before. So, as I say here in the first slide, no one in East Asia publicly doubted the authenticity of the Mahāyāna scriptures until the 18th century in Japan. There's only one mention I have found so far of anyone in the history of Buddhism in China even questioning the authenticity of Mahāyāna, but this was immediately dismissed and not taken seriously. So that doesn't mean that people didn't privately consider it the problem, because anyone who was a serious scholar of the Buddhist scriptures, the Buddhist canon, and the way the history of Buddhism described even within Chinese sources would have seen that there seems to be a kind of change that happens, an evolution, as I said, in which Mahāyāna becomes more and more prominent from the Mahāyāna perspective. In late Meiji, this stuff really hits the fan, and this happens not only within Buddhist scholarship about India, but within what we call shugaku as well, the scholarship within individual sects. The challenge, of course, was to therefore the authority and the veracity of what we know of, what the Japanese knew of as Buddhism at that time, which we have to recognize as a really only functioning religion in Japan until the Meiji period in a socially organized sense. So a lot of this is connected to the founding of the Tokyo Imperial University. It's very interesting that the Tokyo Imperial University, which comes from, like many universities, as a combination of different schools, moves to the Hongo campus as we know it today in 1877. Some people date that to the beginning of the school, but already by 1879, we have a chair in Buddhist Studies. The first professor in that chair, Hara Tanzan, because Buddhist Studies really has no history until this time, even though it's been going in Europe for a little bit. Hara Tanzan thinks that in fact what he should be doing is focusing on the relationship between mental states and illness. So that's what he does. But that doesn't really have much lasting power. After Hara is replaced in 1890 by Murakami Sensho, Hara's approach to studying Buddhism essentially fades away. Murakami shifts the methodology to what we call critical philology, which has been the center, the standard methodological approach ever since. And he works on Indian Buddhism. Again, because the burning question at that time is, what is our history, right? What can we gain from a critical analysis of the materials that we have to reconstruct that history? Note that Hara was ordained as a Soto priest. Murakami is ordained in the Shinshu faith, the Otaniha, that is Higashi Honganji. This is a very important part of the story that's often overlooked, is that many of these scholars, in fact, were either come from very devout Buddhist families, or they're actually ordained in one tradition or another. So Murakami, Murakami Sensho is famous for being the person that put forward this published, very well-read essays about the questioning of the authenticity, the historical authenticity of Mahayana. Note that he worked extensively in Chinese. He did not know Sanskrit. He did not read Pali. In fact, one of the questions that was been raised by Soeki Sensei is when Hara Tanzan was going to retire and they were looking for his successor. Why did they choose Murakami and not Nanjo Bunyu? Nanjo had studied Sanskrit for 8 years in Oxford with Max Mueller, and had already published his catalog of the Chinese canon. So Nanjo had a kind of Sanskrit and Chinese capability of reading that Murakami did not. And yet the university chose to hire Murakami. So, how to answer that question is something I'm not going to get into, but that's something to think about. In any case, in the 1890s, Murakami, who's very, very powerful scholar without question, started a journal called the Bukkyo Shirin. I have been unable to get see this because no library in America has it, but he wrote most of the articles in it. He has other people like Washio Junkei also contribute. And that's where he explores, various notions of methodology. In other words, he's trying to create the methodology that will work for him and for the field. Here he does broach the topic of Mahayana being a kind of later development. And he's interested, he has a kind of sophisticated approach in that he doesn't dismiss the kind of, shall we say, non-historically verifiable things like miracles and visions and information gained from dream confrontations with people, et cetera, et cetera. This is the kind of thing that later on Tsuji Zendosuke, in his massive study of the history of Buddhism, would severely criticize and dismiss as being ridiculous. But this shows that Murakami had a kind of sympathy that Tsuji did not to the tradition. Now, today Murakami is remembered most for his book Bukkyo Toitsuron, a collection of monographs trying to present a unified theory of Buddhism. He kind of gives up on this afterward, but at this time, this is one approach to, again, I think the situation in which the government hostility to Buddhism has created a lot of sensitivity about maybe all these sectarian divides are not helping us. We should unify to keep ourselves strong, both against the government and against the Christian missionaries who are both hostile to us. He brought in the first essay, the first monograph that's in Bukkyo Toichidon called the Daikodon. He discusses this question about how to think about the Mahāyāna Sutras. But a more interesting and more informative work is something called Daiju Busetsuron Hihan, published in 1903. And there he goes into a lot of detail. And he also discusses, in fact, the difference between history versus doctrine, and he's trying to create some kind of a mechanism whereby the religion as it is known can be saved, despite the fact that the historical evidence suggests that these scriptures are not authentically the word of the Buddha. So the word in Sanskrit for this is Buddha Vachana. And when something is considered Buddha Vachana, the word of the Buddha, it has a kind of unassailable authority. If the Mahayana scriptures are not Buddha Vachana, then that raises all sorts of questions, or that allows all sorts of questions to be raised. Murakami is ordained in the Shinshu church, but he gives that up in 1901 when he publishes this Bukkyo Koron. So we don't know much of the detail about that, other than that he voluntarily resigned, but the presumption is that he was pressured to do this after he discussed with the church leaders about his publications and where he was going. And we have a number of people who have suffer career-wise because of their published scholarship. I mentioned here Kyoza Manshi, Inoue Enryo. Similarly, Inoue resigns his own status and clerical status in order to do scholarship. In the 1920s, Kanakodai and Noromoro Naotaro both published works questioning the historical veracity of the Pure Land faith, even though they themselves are ordained Pure Land priests teaching in Pure Land universities in Kyoto. The idea is that these people want to open up the discussion, and the church is uncomfortable with this because of the church's obligation to the believing public, who is not necessarily ready for these kind of very far-reaching questions. So What I want to point out here today is that the contextualizing of the Daijo Hibutsu comes from really five different sources before Murakami, some of which Murakami recognizes. There is Edo-period anti-Buddhist scholarship that tries to, that questions the legitimacy of Mahayana or tries to deal with it. There's Edo-period pro-Buddhist scholarship that also is trying to figure out how to deal with the Mahayana Sutras, given the fact that we can see that, in fact, they are a later development. There's 19th century Western scholarship on Buddhism that is anti-Buddhist, and there's 19th century Western scholarship that is pro-Buddhist, but also has a problem with the Mahayana scriptures. And there's also some Meiji-period scholarship in Japan from the 1880s and 1890s also going in this direction. So I'm not going to have a lot of time to get into the details of all of this, but I'm just going to go through it real quickly. So here's the first group, the anti-Buddhist scholarship. And most famous is Tominaga Nakamoto's Shitsugo Kogo. This has been his methodology has been thoroughly studied by Hubert Dirt in a book called Problems of Chronology and Eschatology, published, I guess, in the 1980s. That's a very hard book to get, but I'm lucky to have a copy from back then. And Tominaga was a brilliant scholar. He published 3 books in his short lifetime. He's really connected with the Neo-Confucian side of Kokugaku and how that's growing in Japan. And his methodology was perceived to be, and his conclusions, very polemic at the time by many Buddhists. But Murakami and others in the Meiji period realized that there's a lot to be admired in the way he approached things. Again, Tominaga is only working within the Chinese Buddhist canon. There's another person from this time called Hattori Tenyu. So, by the way, Nobunaga's methodology is called kajo, right? The idea that things develop and there are accretions and growths and new things added to what had been there before. Hattori Tenyu's, in his book, Sekirara, is much more critical. He characterizes Mahayana as a cover-up and completely false. So this really leads into and serves the kind of radical development in the Kokugaku history happening after Kokugaku really gets started. And we see this with Asaina Atsunari and Hirata Atsutane. And these are the works that they raised their very strong criticism. Now, Edo-period pro-Buddhist scholarship, this is connected to a number of people who seem to favor the return to a pre-Mahayana notion of the Vinaya, that is the monastic rules and how to run a monastery. And so there's a very interesting kind of movement. When the Tendai school started and they adopted the Bodhisattva precepts, this was a far reduced number of rules that the monks and nuns had to live by. And this was very successful. This has certainly contributed to the success of Tendai. The new schools of Kamakura Buddhism all followed the Tendai lead in this regard. When we get to the Edo period, there's a real strong pushback against this. The Rishu, the Vinaya school in Japan, had long since disappeared. I mean, even in the Kamakura period, people like Eison are trying to revive it, but they don't really have the authority to enforce the traditional pre-Mahayana notion of the Vinaya, in which the rules are not 48 or 80, but in fact, they're 250. It's a far more rigid system. You're not allowed to hold money, for example, not allowed to work, et cetera, et cetera. But in the Edo period, a lot of people are saying this is really what Japan needs. And this is tied to the delegitimization of Mahayana, because Mahayana has, at least in the Chinese view, has its own view of the precepts. And this is a result of apocryphal scriptures written in China that claim to have a kind of Mahayana perspective on monasticism. Without getting into that, the main people here that influence this dialogue are monks called Kyoju and Fujaku. Kyoju was ordained in Jodoshu. Today he's called Jodo Shuritsu or Jodo Rishu. and he entirely rejects Mahayana, and in fact claims that Japanese Buddhism has gone awry precisely because it went away from the Vinaya, and that the only authentic Buddhism that Japan got from China was Daoshuan, the Vinaya master. Fujaku, who seems to be connected to Kyoju in some way, also wanted to return to the pre-Mahayana Vinaya. He's ordained in Shinshu, but then moves to Jodoshu, where there's more acceptability of a more strict monastic lifestyle, because as you know, the Shinshu faith had a married clergy, so that their sense of the precepts is far reduced. But Fujaku doesn't recognize, he recognizes Mahayana doctrines are missing in the early sutras, but he puts forth this theory that in fact there were two transmissions. There was a public transmission and a private transmission of the Buddhist teachings. And the private Dharma, the Shiho, is in fact what Mahayana was. And later on, people organized that and wrote those up and called them sutras, and that they may have come from the mouth of the Buddha anyway, but they do not appear in the early tradition because the schools that were in charge of things, in other words, the politics inside the Sangha in India prevented that from coming forward. Kaijo is another monk in this regard. He's a Shingon Buzanha, and he just looks at the material, recognizes there's a problem, but decides that anything that says it's the word of the Buddha reflects the intentionality of the Buddha. It's sort of a expansion of Fujaku's claim, and he's also very much influential in this discussion. There are a number of other people that are defending the traditional view that I'm not mentioning here, but there was quite a lively debate that started from the 740, 750 onward. Much of it influenced by Tobinaga's work, but it goes way beyond that. So there's a whole area of study that really hasn't been looked at until recently. Now we get to Western scholarship. The most influential person in Japan at this time is a guy named M.L. Gordon, who's a Congregationalist missionary who taught at Doshisha and was famous for giving fiery speeches denouncing Buddhism as the object to the true faith. He took it upon himself to educate the missionary community in Japan about the fact that they needed to study Buddhism in order to understand what they were up against. And he's very clear about the fact that neither Shinto or Confucianism really represented Japanese religious feeling, that it was very much Buddhist. And he publishes a number of different things. And I mentioned one here called Mira Monogatari, in which he specifically goes after the faith in Amida Buddha, because it seems to be similar to the Christian faith. But of course, for him, it's inauthentic. That Buddha doesn't have any historical reality, as opposed to Jesus, who was historically real, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Gordon's scholarship on Buddhism is largely based on sources coming out of England, notably Max Muller and Rhys Davids. But another source for him is a missionary working in China named Joseph Edkins, who publishes a very interesting book in Chinese. I give here the Japanese pronunciation, Kakuretsu Jakohen, but also in English, Edkins. Edkins is actually quite a linguist and did a lot of work on Chinese linguistics, again, but very dedicated, very devoted missionary. His motivation, of course, was again to spread the word of the gospel. Now, Max Muller is the most interesting person probably in this entire story, as far as I'm concerned, because I was not aware of the very strong anti-Mahayana writings that he did. But he makes some comments in an article published in 1880 in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society after working on a Sanskrit manuscript of the Skabhati Sutra brought to him by Nanjo. Nanjo arrives at Oxford, and in his studies with Muller mentions that we have Sanskrit manuscripts in Japan. One of the most famous is Skabhati Vyuha, and Muller at that time is very, very desperate to find more Buddhist manuscripts, and so urges him to get a copy of this so they could work on it in England. Nanjo does this, they translate it, and after in a kind of addendum to the translation, Muller makes some very strong critical comments, and I have put these here in the PowerPoint. So let me just read these quickly. This sutra sounds to us, no doubt, very different from the original teaching of Buddha, and so it is. Nevertheless, it is the most popular and most widely read sutra in Japan. There's a great future in store, I believe, for those Eastern islands. She's referring to Japan, which have been prophetically called the England of the East. And to purify and reform their religion, that is, to bring it back to its original form, is a work that must be done before anything else can be attempted. And here is another part of his comment. It may be that in a lower stage of civilization, even such teachings had produced some kind of good, but Japan is surely ripe for better things. So again, this is this critique of Skavati Vyuha Sutra. Is it not high time that the millions who live in Japan and profess a faith in Buddha should be told that this doctrine of Amitabha and all the Mahayana doctrine is a secondary form of Buddhism, a corruption of the pure doctrine of the royal prince, referring to Siddhartha, of course, and that if they really mean to be Buddhists, they should return to the words of the Buddha as they are preserved to us in the old sutras, instead of depending as they do now on Chinese translations, not always accurate, of degrading Mahayana tracts. Why should they not have Japanese translations of the best portion of the Buddha's real doctrine, which would elevate their character and give them a religion of which they need not be ashamed? Now, I doubt Nanjo was ashamed, but this is certainly a projection coming from Max Mueller. All right. Oh, okay. The other people that are really influential in this regard is people from the Polytech Society, particularly Thomas Rhys Davids has a number of really remarkably polemic statements about Mahayana. To him, pure Buddhism is early Buddhism, Northern Buddhism is corrupt Buddhism. He says this over and over again. Monier Williams similarly wrote of true Buddhism, that is the Buddhism of the Pitakas or Polytechs. So E.J. Idle is known to those of us who work on East Asian Buddhism because he produced really the first kind of dictionary of Chinese Buddhist terms. He was involved in translations, again, in this very early stage in the second half of the 19th century. He referred to earlier Buddhism also as pure Buddhism, to Tibetan Buddhism as corrupt Buddhism, and to Tantric Buddhism as loathsome and nauseous. I'm sorry, I seem to have copied the same thing by mistake here. In any case, I just want to point out that the scholarship in Britain at this time reflected in people like Idle and the Polytech Society scholars seems to reflect a movement happening in Britain and in Europe, which is this search for the historical Jesus. There are a number of essays published in the 1840s and 1850s about this. Albert Schweitzer also, of course, is very much involved in this search of the historical Jesus. This search for the historical Buddha reflects the same assumption that we can get back to who the Buddha was, the man, right, then we will know what Buddhism actually was in the beginning. And the assumption is that that will give us the true, original, pure form that is the most authentic. Other Meiji-period pro-Buddhist scholars in Japan are people like Inoue Enryo, Inoue Tetsujiro, Anasaki Masaharu. All of them taught at one time or another in Tokyo Imperial University. Anasaki is famous for sort of being the founder of religious studies in Japan. He publishes treatises starting 1899, 1900, very similarly attacking Mahayana as inauthentic. He quotes, to say, we must liberate the truth faith from the pathology of superstition. So that's sort of in a nutshell what I wanted to talk about. And the conclusion here, I guess, is that this is how knowledge about history forces a reconsideration of presumed truth and brings forth questions that can be very troubling and very difficult, and yet can in fact be very helpful in the end if proper solutions can be found. So the Christian missionaries certainly saw this dialogue about questioning the authenticity, or you might say the historicity, of the Mahayana teachings as their opening to pry Japan away from Buddhism and to show the Japanese people the path to what they considered, of course, authentic religion. But problems about the origins of Christianity also circulated in Meiji Japan. So as much as the Christians talk about the fact that the Buddhist scriptures are a product of history, the Japanese are learning about European scholarship talking about how the Bible is also the product of history. And it's worth mentioning that I don't remember exactly when, but certain time in the middle of the 19th century, German linguistic scholarship shows that in fact what the Old Testament says about its own development is in fact fiction and can't be true based on the structure of the Hebrew that has evolved over time in the Bible itself. Of course, we know the Gospel of John is written 100 years after the time of Jesus. There's a lot of historical problems, of course, about the problems, if you want to consider that, about the development of how the Bible is constructed as well. But working in the 1880s, when people like Gordon are very, very active, this was not an issue for them. They ignored anything that questioned their own faith. But this is a problem, of course, for religion coming into the modern period. And what's different about Japan is that this comes in very, very early compared to other Buddhist countries. So Japan has to deal with this. Japan has a history of dealing with it already for 150 years or so. And in the end, this line from Fujaku that Murakami also uses as kind of his way out of the problem, which is that there's this private transmission of the truth, is not the one that really becomes the most convincing. In fact, the real resolution of this problem was quite a bit later in the 1920s when people start to publish things along the lines of the Mahāyāna teachings work. That's how we know they're authentic, even if the historical development of them went through various iterations that cannot be traced back to the time of the Buddha himself. Okay, that's my conclusion. Okay, Marta.
So thank you so much, Marcus, for such a fascinating presentation. You really gave us a great overview about the development of and the birth of Buddhist studies as a field, right? I was, particularly interested by Murakami's idea of Mahāyāna Sutra as, apocryphal text and not being the real words of the Buddha. I'd like to ask you if you could tell us more about how what kind of methodology he used to claim that those were not real Mahāyāna Sutra, and how do you think that this kind of claim actually impacted philology and the study of Buddhism, in the sense that going back to the roots and the use of philology to rediscover the roots or authenticity? And I would also like to ask you if his claims actually, had an impact on how Buddhism was seen in the West. You mentioned before Mueller in Oxford, so I wonder if this kind of claim actually started a debate in Buddhist studies, or the beginning of Buddhist studies at the time.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I can say that, am I speaking? Yeah, okay. I can say that the core methodological issue that comes up is in these early councils. And so this is the same thing that Tominaga notices. And this is sort of the basis of Tominaga Nakamoto's whole theory. And Murakami respects that and sees the validity of this. And other people talk about this as well in the Edo period. And that is that the first council, the way the first council is described, there's nothing Mahayana in it, okay? And so the presumption is therefore that it's only later that we have sort of Mahayana material presented. We even have supposedly Mahayana councils. This is all based on material, the description within the Chinese canon. And so that's the problem. And so, also the other issue, of course, is we have these translations of these pre-Mahayana material or non-Mahayana material called agamas that come from Sanskrit into the Chinese canon. And people like Murakami is such an excellent scholar that he's looking at all this material. And so he's also seeing, in fact, that there's a lot of, that there is a kind of development of ideas, and a lot of Mahayana doctrines that don't appear in these early treatises. Now, I haven't read enough of Murakami's essay to get into the specific details of. What I've seen so far is he doesn't talk about the agamas so much in too much detail, because we know some of the agamas, in fact, do have Mahayana, what we consider Mahayana material in them. And, it is, one of the things that Murakami does that's really interesting that's often overlooked is he doesn't always necessarily call it the Daijo Hibutsu. He often calls it the Daijo Setsu. In other words, the question is should not be framed. Murakami's conclusion is the problem should not be framed as the inauthenticity of the Mahayana teachings, but in fact, what are the Mahayana teachings? How do we understand them in a historical context? And how do we make sense of them? And so in that sense, he can't really answer the question is where these ideas come from, right? But as I concluded in the very end of the last slide, what really happens in Japan is that people start to assert that the Mahayana scriptures are relevant because they resonate with people, because they work, and they've been effective for centuries, right? So even if in India they are the product of some later development, that doesn't mean they're inauthentic in that sense. And I suppose one way to think about this would be to separate the teachings from the scriptures, okay? So even though the teachings are in the scriptures, there's also something that Murakami mentions that I thought was pretty interesting and other people pick up on, which is that even when Xuanzang and Faxin go to India, what they notice is a lot of the monks there are not reading scriptures, they're hearing them. In other words, it's still an oral transmission. So what the Pali scholars, the Pali Text Society people do is they emphasize the fact that they use the histories of Buddhism created in Sri Lanka, the Chulabhara and the Mahavagga, which claim that the Buddhist scriptures under this king in Sri Lanka were first written down, right? And since they've been written down, this is our unbroken transmission. And I think the Japanese scholars are not really impressed with that material. I mean, they realize that those histories are also the product of history. And so that does not authenticate the early transmission more than anything else. So this is also a product of how the understanding of the language of Buddhism also evolves over time, right? But that's also a fascinating, subject as to how, the knowledge of Pali and Sanskrit and Prakrit, and the fact that Buddha did not speak Pali and he did not speak Sanskrit, he spoke Magadhi, right? So all this stuff, this becomes more and more clear when you get to the 1920s and 1930s. And so then there seems to be less trouble. But nonetheless, this doesn't mean that the sectarian institutions were not affected by this. And as I mentioned these two Pure Land Shinshu scholars who lost their jobs in the 1920s because they dared to publish books questioning what is their own tradition, right? And so it's the same thing with the Shobogenzo in the case of Dogen, for example. There's a lot of very, you might say, uncomfortable scholarship around the Shobogenzo, which shows that, well, which edition is the authentic one, et cetera, et cetera. And, and it's fascinating to me to see the way sectarian institutions evolve because you have political leadership. So for example, in the case of this, I'm going on too long here. In the case of Kaneko, we know that Kaneko publishes this book called Joro no Kanden, the idea of the Pure Land. And in fact, he's teaching from that book in his lectures at the university, at Otani University, and the students are happy with it. The problem happens only when the parents of some of the students see what their students are reading, their children are reading. They pick up the book or they read it and they say, oh my God, what kind of education are they getting? They go to the Honzan, they complain about this. And that's when the leadership of the church feels that they have to crack down. So it's an ambivalent situation. The same way Kyozawa Manshi is thrown out of the church and then brought back and asked to create a university to represent the church. It shows that the leadership are in a very particularly difficult situation. So that's a big part of the problem.
Thank you, Mark and Martha, for the fantastic event and discussion.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.